What Hitler said when 6,000 Italian troops surrendered without firing a shot. Cold open. The telephone rang at 3:47 in the morning. Adolf Hitler's hand shot out from beneath the wool blanket, knocking a glass of water onto the floor of his private bedroom at the Wolfsschanze. The crash barely registered. His fingers found the receiver in the darkness, and he pressed it against his ear without speaking, his jaw already tight. Mein Führer! The voice belonged to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. It was thin, apologetic, the sound of a man who had rehearsed his opening line a dozen times. I regret to inform you that we have received confirmation from Generalleutnant Rommel's headquarters. Hitler sat upright, the sheets pooling around his waist. Outside the bunker complex, East Prussia slept beneath a moonless January sky. Inside, the air was stale and cold, and Hitler's breath came shallow and sharp. Confirmation of what? Keitel hesitated. In that pause, Hitler's mind raced through the possibilities. Another British counter-offensive, supply lines severed, Tobruk fallen again, but when Keitel finally spoke, the words were worse than any tactical setback. The Pavia Division, 6,000 men. They surrendered to a single company of British infantry near Bardia, no resistance. They simply laid down their arms. Hitler said nothing, his knuckles whitened around the receiver. The British commander reported he had fewer than 200 men, Keitel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They walked into the Italian positions expecting a fight. The Italians were waiting with their hands raised. The line went quiet except for the faint crackle of distance. Hitler's other hand gripped the edge of the mattress, nails digging into fabric. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, venomous, each word bitten off at the root. "Get me Mussolini!" He slammed the receiver down before Keitel could respond. For a long moment, Hitler sat motionless in the dark, staring at nothing. Then he stood, pulled on his uniform jacket over his nightshirt, and walked barefoot down the concrete corridor toward the map room. The question wasn't just military, it was existential. What kind of war could be won with allies who wouldn't fight? Flashback to context. The cracks in the Axis alliance had been visible since the summer of 1940, but no one in Berlin had wanted to see them. When Benito Mussolini declared war on France and Britain in June of that year, Hitler had been skeptical. Not publicly. Publicly, he praised Italy's entry into the conflict as a great moment of fascist solidarity. But privately, in conversations with Goering and Ribbentrop, he expressed doubt. The Italian military was poorly equipped, poorly led, and entirely unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. Their invasion of France had been an embarrassment, gaining almost no ground against a French army already collapsing under German pressure. But Hitler needed Italy, not for its military strength, which he increasingly doubted, but for its geographic position. The Mediterranean, North Africa, the Balkans, Italy was a strategic pillar, and Mussolini's ego required careful management. By December 1940, that management had failed. Mussolini, desperate to prove Italian martial prowess, launched an invasion of Greece without consulting Berlin. It was supposed to be swift, a propaganda coup to match Hitler's triumphs in Poland and France. Instead, it turned into a disaster. Greek forces pushed the Italians back into Albania, and by winter, Italian troops were freezing in the mountains, undersupplied, demoralized, and dying in droves. Hitler was forced to intervene. German divisions poured into the Balkans, first to bail out Mussolini's Greek debacle, then to secure the region against British interference. The Greek campaign delayed Operation Barbarossa by crucial weeks that would later matter when German panzers stalled in the Russian mud outside Moscow, and then there was North Africa. In September 1940, Italian forces under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani advanced into Egypt from Libya. The offensive was sluggish, cautious, grinding to a halt after 60 miles. Graziani complained constantly about supply shortages, about British air superiority, about the impossible terrain. In December, the British launched Operation Compass, a limited counter-offensive that was supposed to push the Italians back a few miles. It didn't stop there. Within weeks, British Commonwealth forces tore through Italian positions like paper. Entire divisions surrendered en masse. By February 1941, the British had advanced 500 miles, captured 130,000 Italian prisoners, and destroyed 10 divisions. Graziani resigned in disgrace. Hitler, furious and humiliated, dispatched Erwin Rommel to Libya with the newly formed Africa Corps. The orders were clear: stabilize the front, hold Tripoli, prevent a complete Italian collapse. Rommel did more than that. By April, he had launched his own offensive, driving the British back to the Egyptian border. But the fundamental problem remained. The Italian divisions fighting alongside Rommel were unreliable. They lacked modern equipment. Their officers were often incompetent or indifferent, and morale was abysmal. Italian soldiers joked bitterly that they were fighting Mussolini's war with Mussolini's equipment, which meant outdated rifles, insufficient ammunition, and tanks that broke down in the desert heat. German commanders in North Africa learned to plan around Italian weaknesses. Rommel wrote in his diary with barely concealed contempt that Italian units could hold quiet sectors but could not be trusted in offensive operations or under sustained pressure. German liaison officers embedded with Italian divisions reported widespread defeatism. Supplies sent to Italian units often disappeared into black markets. Soldiers went hungry while officers hoarded rations. By late 1941, the situation had calcified into a grim routine. Rommel's German units would attack, Italian divisions would follow at a distance, and when British counterattacks came, the Italians would either retreat or surrender. The British learned to target Italian positions first, knowing they would crumble, exposing German flanks. In Berlin, Hitler raged about it in private but maintained public solidarity with Mussolini. To admit the Italian military's failure would be to admit weakness in the Axis itself. And so the fiction continued. Germany and Italy, brothers in arms, marching together toward victory. Then came the night of January 3, 1942. The Pavia Division, a supposedly elite Italian infantry formation, was dug in near Bardia, a coastal fortress on the Libyan-Egyptian border. The position was strategically insignificant but symbolically important, a forward outpost demonstrating Axis control. The division had been reinforced, resupplied, and ordered to hold at all costs. A single British company, fewer than 200 men, approached the Italian positions before dawn. They expected a firefight. They got a white flag. The core event unfolds January 3, 1942. So 5:20 hours. Bardia, Libya. Captain James Thornton of the 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, crouched behind a limestone outcrop and raised his field glasses. The Italian trenches were visible in the grey pre-dawn light, a zigzag line of sandbags and barbed wire stretching across the low ridge ahead. He expected machine gun fire. He expected mortars. He expected the kind of brutal, grinding fight that had defined the Desert War for 18 months. What he saw instead made him lower the binoculars and blink, certain he was hallucinating. White sheets, dozens of them tied to rifles, fence posts, tent poles, waving slowly in the morning wind. "Sir?" His sergeant, a Yorkshireman named Davies, had seen it too. "Are they—" Christ! Thornton stood, exposing himself fully. No shots rang out. "Get the men up, weapons ready, this could be a trap." But it wasn't a trap. As Thornton's company advanced cautiously across the open ground, Italian soldiers emerged from the trenches with their hands raised. They were young, most of them, thin and exhausted, their uniforms torn and dusty. They didn't look frightened, they looked relieved. An Italian officer, a lieutenant with a neatly trimmed moustache and clean boots, walked forward to meet Thornton. He saluted crisply as if this were a parade ground and spoke in halting English. "We surrender. All 6,000. He gestured back toward the trenches, where more men were emerging, filing out in ragged columns. "No fight, please." Thornton stared at him. "You're surrendering? All of you? To us?" The Italian lieutenant nodded. "Yes. No supplies, no ammunition, no food for 3 days. We cannot fight." Davies leaned close to Thornton and muttered, "Sir, we've got 200 rifles and 1 Bren gun. If they wanted, they could roll right over us." Thornton knew that. But he also knew what he was seeing, men who had given up long before the battle started. "Right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Form them into columns. We'll march them back to our lines." The Italian lieutenant saluted again, turned, and shouted orders in Italian. The men obeyed without hesitation, dropping their weapons into neat piles and assembling into ranks. Some were smiling, others looked blank, traumatized, or simply empty. Thornton watched them for a long moment, then looked at Davies. "Radio HQ. Tell them we've taken 6,000 prisoners. Tell them they didn't fire a shot." Davies stared at him. "They won't believe it." "Neither do I. Send it anyway." 6:30 hours. Rommel's headquarters, near Gazela. General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel was shaving when his chief of staff, Fritz Bayerlein, burst into the tent without knocking. Rommel didn't flinch. He finished the stroke down his jaw, wiped the blade on a towel, and turned to face Bayerlein. "This had better be important." Bayerlein's face was flushed, his breathing heavy. "The Pavia Division. They've surrendered. All of them." Rommel set the razor down slowly. "Casualties? None. Ours or theirs. They just gave up." A single British company walked up and the Italians laid down their weapons. For a moment Rommel said nothing. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of a chair, shrugged it on, and walked past Bayerlein out into the cold morning air. The camp was waking up. German soldiers brewing coffee, checking equipment, cleaning weapons. Normal, routine. He stood there, staring east toward the front lines, his jaw working silently. 6,000 men, he said finally. 6,000, Bearline nodded. The British are moving them back to their POW camps now. They're bragging about it on the radio, calling it the easiest capture of the war. Rommel turned sharply. Get me General Bastico. Ettore Bastico was the Italian commander in North Africa, Mussolini's appointee, a man Rommel privately considered useless. I want him here within the hour. And Berlin. Rommel's eyes were cold. Berlin already knows. 800 hours. The Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. By the time the sun rose over the snow-covered forests of East Prussia, Hitler had been awake for 4 hours. He had not returned to bed. Instead, he had paced the map room, chain-smoking, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the sprawling maps of Europe and North Africa pinned to the walls. Wilhelm Keitel stood near the door, silent, knowing better than to speak unless spoken to. Beside him, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations, held a sheaf of reports fresh from the teletype room. Hitler stopped pacing and turned to face them. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but there was a tremor beneath it. How does this happen? Jodl cleared his throat. The Pavia division was under strength and poorly supplied. Reports indicate— I don't care about reports. Hitler's voice rose suddenly, sharp and venomous. I care about the fact that 6,000 Italian soldiers, 6,000, surrendered to 200 British. 200! He slammed his fist onto the map table. Do they not understand what they've done? Do they not understand what this means? Keitel ventured carefully. Mein Führer, the Italians have been requesting additional supplies. Supplies! Hitler spun toward him, eyes blazing. We send them supplies, we send them equipment, we send them German officers to lead them, and still they collapse like children. He turned back to the map, his finger stabbing at the North African coastline. Rommel is holding that entire front together with spit and willpower. And now the British are laughing at us. They're laughing because our ally, our glorious fascist ally, surrenders without firing a shot, Jodl said quietly. The British propaganda value will be significant. Significant, Hitler laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. It's catastrophic. Every neutral country watching this war just saw Axis soldiers give up en masse. How do you think that looks in Ankara? In Madrid? In Vichy? He turned to Keitel. Get me Mussolini, now. Keitel hesitated. It's still early in Rome, mein Führer. Perhaps now. Keitel nodded and hurried from the room. Hitler returned to the map, his hands gripping the table's edge, his breathing heavy. Jodl remained silent, waiting. Finally, Hitler spoke again, softer this time, almost to himself. They were supposed to be our brothers, our equals, the new Rome. He shook his head slowly. They're not soldiers, they're tourists with rifles. 9:30 hours. Palazzo Venezia, Rome. Benito Mussolini was eating breakfast when the call came through. He was in his private office, a cavernous room with marble floors and high-vaulted ceilings, decorated with busts of Roman emperors. A plate of bread, cheese, and figs sat before him, along with a small cup of espresso. He was reading the morning papers, carefully curated editions that praised Italian victories and minimized defeats. His secretary entered, pale and nervous. Deuce, Berlin is on the line. The Führer wishes to speak with you. Mussolini set down his newspaper slowly. He knew, of course he knew. Word of the Pavia division's surrender had reached him an hour earlier, delivered by a stammering general who had avoided eye contact the entire time. He had hoped to craft a response before Hitler called. Too late now. He stood, straightened his uniform, and walked to the telephone on his desk. He picked up the receiver and forced confidence into his voice. Adolf, good morning. Is it? Hitler's voice crackled through the line, cold and sharp. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your army just handed 6,000 men to the British as a gift. Mussolini's jaw tightened. It was an isolated incident, a breakdown in— Isolated? Hitler interrupted. Greece was isolated. The Ethiopian campaign was isolated. Every single failure your military has produced in the past 2 years has been isolated. When does it stop being isolated and start being a pattern? Mussolini gripped the edge of his desk. My men are fighting under impossible conditions. The British have air superiority, naval superiority, better supply lines. Rommel fights under the same conditions, Hitler snapped. The difference is his men don't throw up their hands at the first sight of the enemy. Silence filled the line. Mussolini's face burned. He wanted to shout back, to defend his soldiers, to remind Hitler that Italy had entered this war as a favor, that Italian blood was being spilled to support German ambitions. But he couldn't. He needed Germany. Without German support, Italy's war effort would collapse entirely. What do you want me to do? He asked finally, his voice flat. I want you to fix your army. Hitler said. I want competent officers. I want soldiers who will fight. I want... He stopped, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, colder, more calculated. I want you to understand something, Benito. The world is watching. Every time your men surrender, it weakens us both. It makes the Axis look weak. It makes us look defeatable. Mussolini closed his eyes. I understand. Do you? Hitler paused. Because I'm not sure you do. I'm not sure you understand how fragile this alliance looks when your divisions collapse like dominoes. I'm not sure you understand what it costs me, politically, strategically, morally, to keep propping up your failures. The words hung in the air like poison. Mussolini felt something twist in his chest, something bitter and humiliating. He wanted to hang up. He wanted to scream. Instead, he said nothing. I'll send more liaison officers, Hitler continued, businesslike now. German officers to oversee your divisions in North Africa, and I'll authorize additional equipment transfers. But understand this, if your men keep surrendering, I will stop wasting German resources on them. I will pull Rommel back and let the British take Libya, and when that happens, the blame will fall on you. It won't happen again, Mussolini said, his voice tight. See that it doesn't. The line went dead. Mussolini stood there for a long moment, the receiver still pressed against his ear, listening to the empty hiss of static. Finally he set it down, walked to the window, and stared out at Rome, at the ancient ruins, the churches, the monuments to a civilization that had once conquered the known world. He wondered, not for the first time, if he had made a terrible mistake. Second layer of consequences. January 4th, 1942. British headquarters, Cairo. The mood in Cairo was electric. General Claude Auchinleck, commander of the British Eighth Army, read the intelligence reports with barely concealed satisfaction. 6,000 Italian prisoners, captured without a fight, now sat in POW camps outside Alexandria. The propaganda value was immense. Already the BBC was broadcasting the story across Europe, framing it as evidence of Axis weakness. But Auchinleck was a professional. He knew better than to mistake Italian incompetence for German vulnerability. Rommel was still out there, dangerous and unpredictable, and the Africa Corps remained a formidable force. Still, this was useful, very useful. He called his intelligence chief, Brigadier Francis de Guingand, into his office. What are we hearing from intercepts? De Guingand laid a file on the desk. Plenty. German signals traffic spiked after the surrender. Rommel's furious. He's demanding Italian units be pulled from frontline positions and relegated to logistics. And Berlin? Hitler personally called Mussolini. We don't have the content, but Italian diplomatic cables afterward show panic. Rome is scrambling to reassure Berlin. Auchinleck leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. So the alliance is fraying. More than fraying. The Italians are humiliated. The Germans are contemptuous. This could be an opening. Auchinleck nodded slowly. Keep monitoring. If we can exploit this, drive a wedge between Rome and Berlin, it might be worth more than a dozen battlefield victories. January 5th, 1942. A bar in Milan. Giovanni Rossi sat hunched over a glass of cheap wine in a dimly lit bar near the Piazza del Duomo. He was 32, a factory worker, a father of two. He had tried to enlist in 1940, caught up in the patriotic fervor of Mussolini's speeches, but had been rejected due to flat feet. Now, 2 years later, he was grateful. Around him, other men muttered quietly, their voices low and bitter. The news from North Africa had reached Milan by radio, filtered through the government's usual propaganda machinery, but people knew, they always knew. 6,000 men, someone said. 6,000. They didn't even fight, another voice added. Just gave up. Giovanni stared into his wine. He thought of his cousin Marco, who had been drafted and sent to Libya 6 months ago. Marco's letters had stopped coming in October. Giovanni didn't know if he was alive, dead, or captured. The government wouldn't say. They call us cowards, the first man said. The Germans, they call us cowards, and maybe they're right. They starve us, Giovanni said quietly, not looking up. They send us to die with rifles from the last war, and when we fail, they call us cowards. No one argued. The bartender refilled glasses in silence. Outside, the winter rain fell steadily, drumming against the cobblestones. January the 6th, 1942. Wehrmacht High Command, Berlin, in a secure conference room deep inside the Bendler block, Germany's military headquarters, a group of senior officers gathered for a closed-door assessment. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, recently replaced as commander-in-chief of the army, sat at the head of the table. Beside him were Keitel, Jodl, and several others. The mood was grim. The Pavia incident is not an anomaly, Jodl said, laying out reconnaissance photos and intelligence summaries. It's symptomatic of a deeper rot in the Italian military structure. Morale is collapsing. Officer quality is abysmal. Supply corruption is endemic. Keitel nodded. The Führer has ordered German liaison officers embedded at all levels of Italian command in North Africa, but frankly, I don't know if it will help. Von Brauchitsch, usually cautious, spoke bluntly. We are trying to fight a two-front war with an ally that can't hold a single front. Every division we commit to propping up Italy is a division we can't use in Russia. Withdrawing support isn't an option, Jodl countered. If Italy collapses, we lose the Mediterranean, we lose access to Middle Eastern oil, we lose strategic depth in southern Europe. Then what do we do? Someone asked. Silence. No one had an answer. Finally, von Brauchitsch spoke again. We do what we've always done. We compensate. We allocate more German units to North Africa. We take direct operational control away from Italian commanders. And we pray Rommel can hold the line long enough for us to win in Russia. It was a plan built on hope. They all knew it. Broader strategic implications. The surrender of the Pavia division was a single moment, a single data point in the sprawling calculus of World War II. But it revealed something fundamental about the Axis alliance. It was not an alliance of equals. Hitler had built his vision of fascist solidarity on the assumption that Italy, reborn under Mussolini, would be a modern warrior state, a partner capable of matching German military prowess. That assumption had always been more ideological than empirical. The reality, visible in Greece, in North Africa, in the Balkans, was that Italy's military was structurally incapable of waging modern mechanized warfare. The reasons were complex. Italy had entered World War I late and emerged economically devastated. Mussolini's fascist state had focused on propaganda and spectacle over genuine military modernization. Italian industry lagged far behind Germany's in production capacity, technological sophistication, and logistical coordination. Italian officers were often selected for political loyalty rather than competence. And Italian soldiers, conscripted from a population that had never fully embraced Mussolini's imperial ambitions, fought without conviction. But the deeper issue was strategic. Hitler needed Italy to control the Mediterranean and pin down British forces in North Africa and the Middle East. Without Italy, Germany's southern flank was exposed, and the path to Soviet oil fields through the Caucasus became infinitely more difficult. So Hitler was trapped. He had to support Italy, even as that support drained resources he desperately needed elsewhere. The Pavia surrender exposed this dynamic to the world. It wasn't just a military failure, it was a propaganda disaster. Neutral nations watching the war saw Axis soldiers surrender en masse. Resistance movements in occupied Europe took heart. And within Germany itself, senior officers began to quietly question whether Italy was worth the cost. Hitler understood this. That's why his rage that morning at the Wolfsschanze was more than personal frustration. It was existential fear. The Axis was supposed to project strength, inevitability, destiny. Instead, it was revealing cracks that enemies could exploit. And they did. Over the next 2 years, British and American forces would repeatedly target Italian positions, knowing they would crumble. The invasion of Sicily in 1943 succeeded in part because Italian coastal defenders surrendered or retreated en masse. And when Mussolini was overthrown in July 1943, Italy's exit from the Axis shocked no one who had been paying attention. The seeds of that collapse were visible in January 1942, in a dusty trench near Bardia, where 6,000 men chose survival over loyalty. Closing scene, January 10, 1942, a prisoner of war camp near Alexandria, Private Luca Benetti sat on the ground outside a British Army tent, his back against a wooden post staring at the desert sky. He was 19 years old. He had been drafted 9 months ago, sent to Libya with promises of glory and victory. Instead, he had spent those months digging trenches, rationing stale bread, and waiting for orders that never made sense. When the British came, he had felt only relief. Now, as a prisoner of war, he had food, not much, but more than he'd had in weeks. He had water, he had a blanket, and most importantly, he was alive. Around him, other Italian prisoners sat or lay in the sun, talking quietly, smoking cigarettes traded from British guards. Some looked ashamed, others looked defiant, most just looked tired. Luca thought about his mother back in Naples, about his little sister, about the life he'd left behind. He wondered if they knew where he was. He wondered if they thought he was a coward. He didn't feel like a coward. He felt like someone who had survived. A British guard walked past, a young corporal with a sunburned nose. He glanced at Luca and nodded. Luca nodded back. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Luca closed his eyes, tilted his face toward the sun, and let the warmth soak into his skin. Somewhere far away, generals and dictators were screaming about honor and strategy and destiny. Here in this camp, none of that mattered. Here, he was just a soldier who had decided not to die for someone else's war. And he didn't regret it.